just say a little prayer for those kids who have had a whole summer of no structure, for those Sunday school teachers. Good morning. I didn't introduce myself if you are visiting. My name is Jacqui. I am one of the pastors here. And all summer, we have been talking about where God is in the summer. So we, as Calgarians, we hustle through this winter, and then all of a sudden, nothing is wrong with the world, and it's gorgeous, and we are out there, and we are hiking and camping and beekeeping and gardening and doing all these things. So we thought, let's lean on that and wonder where God is even in those moments where we are very present to the world. I've just gotten back from our own holidays. We always do a road trip out to BC. We go visit Brad's folks in Vancouver every summer. And then this summer we spent some time on Salt Spring Island in a cabin on a lake, and it was glorious. And I'm so happy to be home. But I was thankful for the time away. And it was gorgeous. I think one of the things I learned, I sent this into Mel, so I don't actually know if she said it or not. So if you've heard this last week, you might have. But one of the things I just was soaking in from that time on the island, because everything moves a lot slower on one of the Gulf Islands, because there's no traffic lights. You just wake up when you wake up, you wander down to the store, you buy your breakfast, you come back, and everything is slower. And I was just like, whoa, this is a glorious moment to remember what it's like to move at the pace of human, not like up and hustle and run and get out the door and all of those things that kind of build up over the course of the school year. And it was a good reminder to just take some time and breathe. The other thing we did that I was so thrilled about is we got to go to in the Lower Mainland in South Surrey, really close to the border, is a Christian environmental stewardship place where they farm and they do community farming for the community around them. They also do conservation. There's a river that goes through there. That's one of the salmon spawning rivers. So they work on restoring that river and creating a good space. And we just went there and looked around and see what the things that they were up to, all in the name of being good stewards and good Christ learners, and that was that space, and it was gorgeous. So a lot of the pictures you'll see are from our trip that's called Arosha. If you want to look it up, it's a Canadian Christian environmental stewardship place. You can look it up, and yeah, we went there, and I brought some honey from there, which I don't even want to open, because once I open it, it's going to start going away and be gone. But I bought some honey. Also, my daughter, my 7-year-old, made this, and she really wanted me to tell you she made it. So it's a bee, if you're wondering. It's a little bit of art. Anyways, so like I just said, if you're new to the road, you will quickly find that one of the things we love to do is talk about how much we believe and trust that God is present in the work and the play and the relationships and the rhythms of our actual real lives, including our summers. So this week we're going to talk about bees. You might not have talked about or thought about bees or beekeeping, or you might be a beekeeper and have thought about it significantly. I can see 2 of you right close to each other, right over there. 3 of you actually, who are beekeepers. So if you hear a factual inaccuracy, tell me after. I am not a beekeeper. I'm learning. But we are asking what the Spirit to show us what we might notice about bees and what that might say to us as people living in neighborhoods, as people living in this environment. So I did want to just mention at the outset the points that I received. I went and visited a hive, but I also read a couple books, and I wanted just to mention them. This book's called The Bees of Rainbow Falls, Finding Faith, Imagination, and Delight in Your Neighborhood, written by a pastor in Chestermere, so one of our neighbors, about beekeeping and neighborhoods, which kind of aligns with a lot of what we talk about. So I was like, I feel like I should read that book, and it's delightful. So I'm going to put it down in the library downstairs if you want, and then the other book is just more of like a information book called Nature's Little Wonders Bees, written by a Saskatoon author, Candace Owen. So those are if you're interested, you can come borrow them, but I wanted to mention that that's where I'm getting a few of my thoughts, and just to give credit where credit's due. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, knowing God by looking at animals, is that normal? And I want to say, yes, it is. Looking at God and attributing looking at animals and attributing virtues and gaining spiritual insight and wisdom is not a new thing at all. We are not reinventing the wheel here. Christians throughout history have been doing this. In the Middle Ages, so kind of between 500 and 1500, roughly, folks did the same thing all the time that I've been doing in prepping for the sermon. They sat in a chair in front of something and they noticed it and watched it, and then they wrote about it and wrote about what they were supposed to learn as Christians from it. So, and these things are called, these medieval allegory, they're called bestiaries. So they're all about animals and what we could learn about them and learn about God about them. So they're kind of like part science, part diagrams, drawings, part devotional. And so sometimes what you'll notice when you read these is sometimes what they noticed about bees, for instance, is completely inaccurate. But so there's, I'm used to the screen being over there. This is one called a couple shots from the Bestiary of Anne Walsh, they think around 1400. And she wrote about bees, and this is what she wrote, or whoever wrote the book. Bees are the smallest of birds. They are born from the bodies of oxen or from the decaying flesh of slaughtered calves. Worms form in the flesh and then turn into bees. So not totally there. Bees live in community and choose the most noble among them as king, have wars, and they make honey. Their laws are based on custom, but the king does not enforce the law. Rather, the lawbreakers punish themselves by stinging themselves to death. Bees are afraid of smoke and excited by noise. That's pretty accurate. And each bee has its own duty, guarding the food supply, watching for rain, collecting dew to make honey, and making wax from the flowers. So some of her understandings and looking, when she's just looking at what she saw as the bees, are not entirely accurate for what we understand now. But as Puteaux, I don't know, I should have asked him how we pronounce his name, Preston Puteaux, who wrote that book, remarks in his book, it's striking how humans have always had a deep sense of orienting themselves to God by orienting themselves to the world. The wonder that we have when we look at the world is real. And it's our privilege, and it's kind of our inheritance as humans, but as Christians, to look around and then to also look up and be amazed at what we see. So kind of like what Karen was talking about. So this morning, looking at the bees is definitely part of this heritage. One of the first things to do, if you're going to talk about bees, for me, was to visit some bees. So Ken and Louise are members of our community. They're not here today. They're on holidays. But they keep bees in their backyard, and they invited me to come and experience the bees. It just so happened Ken had to go into the hive on this weekend in July, and I got to be there to witness it. So they suited me up. That's me on the right. That's me on the right, in the onesie with the rubber boots, and they gave me some big, thick work gloves, and then they duct taped the work gloves around just in case, around my wrists, and then I had the big hat on with the netting. I called it the hedge of protection, so no bees got close to my face. And they gave me this advice over and over. They said things like this. They said, be calm. Don't move fast. Don't freak out. Don't be afraid to get close. Go slow and you'll be just fine. Which, as I reflect on it, is probably some of the best life advice I've ever gotten. So I'm going to write that out on my fridge. Don't freak out, you're going to be fine. And I watched as Ken, and Pete was there too, but I watched as Ken opened the hive to check it. And he had prepped his smoker, which the smoke slows them down, it calms the bees a bit. And he made it clear that he doesn't go into his hive very often. You don't want to disturb what they're doing all the time. But he pulled out each slide, and we saw the honeycomb and the production of wax and honey, and he showed how the different bees, the drones, the workers, the little babies in there, and we were looking for the queen, and he could not find it, so he was wondering what was going on. Ken and Louise were filled with facts and information. I took so many notes. They talked to me for 2 hours about bees and beekeeping and all of these things. These are folks who have found joy in stewarding this little part of creation really faithfully. And there's so many things to notice and love about how bees work. So I gave you a fact earlier in the morning, but here's another little fact. Do you know the bees only go to one kind of plant at a time? They don't go to like a daisy and then a rose and then this. They go to one type of plant. That's how they pollinate it, and then they take all of that back to the hive, and then they go and maybe find a different plant. And I just thought, oh, how interesting. I never thought about that, but of course that's what they do, and that's how the whole system works together, and it's a beautiful little detail. And so, but further than just fun facts I'm going to give you, I wanted to talk about what kind of things this could open up in us, what kind of questions we could ask about ourselves as individuals, but also as a community. So maybe we could listen in some of the facts that, or the things we notice for those encouragements. So there's a few things, I wrote them out, that I think is good for us to notice this morning. And there's probably going to be more. You'll probably be like, well, I know this about bees and it's important. That's great. These are just 3 I noticed and I thought they could be good for us this morning. First, bees are a keystone species. So I'm going to unpack that in a little bit. The second thing is that they work together to do really complex things. And they do this in 2 ways, each bee contributing a tiny amount to the bigger whole, and by growing and changing it throughout their lives. So worker bees will grow and change throughout their lives, contributing in unique ways as required. And the third is that we're going to take a step back and then look at the role of the beekeeper and see what that could challenge us to reimagine in ourselves what the community of Christ could be like. I have a hint, and I'll get to it. It's idealism is the enemy, and I'm going to get back to that in a second. But to go to the keystone species. So bees are keystone species, and this was pointed out really well in Puto's book. I give full credit for the point and the questions it raises to him. So you may know the word keystone from architecture, right? So you have those huge cathedrals in Europe with those big arches, and those are made possible by the presence of keystones. And they're these sometimes small, but really pivotally, don't make up words on the spot, Jacqui. Really importantly placed stones that enable the arch to be. So they have this place of integrity, they give stability to the whole structure. And the same is true of ecosystems of our creation. There are keystone species that are vital to the whole system. They're probably small, they might not be celebrated, no one's going on safari to see them. But the whole system could not be self-sustaining without them. So beavers would be a keystone species. I love beavers, if you follow my Instagram. Their constant work creates wetlands, and then those themselves create the environment for thousands of other species, insects, birds, plants, that in turn contribute even more to the health of the entire ecosystem, just because of what these beavers are designed to do, make little dams everywhere, wherever they go. And that's important, because we know that the life God created does not exist apart from a healthy ecosystem. So the bees are also a keystone species. Their visits to all these little blossoms in their areas pollinate them. They help the plants reproduce. They grow fruit, which in turn, all of that supports countless of other species, animals, birds, us. About 1/3 of our food comes from pollinated plants. So from a distance, bees are not the most interesting animal. We definitely really don't see them at work unless we're one of those beekeepers. But they are essential and pivotal to a healthy land that provides for its inhabitants. So that got me thinking as I was reflecting on that. And I was reminded of Jesus' metaphor of his followers and of the kingdom that he was bringing. He talked about the kingdom being like yeast in dough, and he talked about the kingdom being like a tiny mustard seed. And these metaphors, they're different than the bee as a keystone species metaphor, but if we're listening, they're saying similar things. What God is doing is not always going to be the most demonstrably powerful or even the most obvious thing. In fact, Jesus seemed to say repeatedly that it's going to be hidden, and it's going to be done in small ways. It's going to seem insignificant, perhaps, and it's probably not even going to be seen by a lot of people at all, but even so, that is going to be pivotal. That work Jesus does is going to be pivotal and will have a huge impact. So the question maybe we could ask as Jesus learners could be this: are we keystone people in our community? In Brentwood, here in Northwest Calgary, or in your community that you live in? Could our slow and attentive, patient work be focused on bringing life to our community? Could our work in our neighborhood make things more beautiful? Do others benefit, and I called it our yeasty, seedy, buzzing bee kind of work, do others benefit from our presence there? What we do might not be the most celebrated at all. It might not be flashable. It's not going to be Instagrammable. But what care and attentiveness could our buzzing in the neighborhood bring to the health of the neighborhood, the productivity, the well-being of it? Here's a quote. Keystone people are precisely placed and work in often unseen ways to hold the space before them, Keystone people are the community connectors, those who see small ideas and bring them to life. They are the eyes of the city, the sages who observe and find patterns. They work to bring pieces together, redeem what is broken, and strive for peace. Keystone people instill a sense of hope that grows beyond themselves, often sacrificially. They love deeply and genuinely, serving with a deep character-shaped influence. They are humble and create a culture of growth, breathing life into everything they do. I like that as a description of church. I like that as a description of a good community. So if we're paying attention to the bees, we could ask, as Poteau suggested, am I a Keystone person? Are we Keystone people, individuals? And as this community of the road, are we postured to bring life to the world around us? And then what goes along with that question is, what would we need to change in our own imagination to become that kind of person? And I like this question because it's not, I think sometimes we hear, okay, now we have to try harder at being this kind of person. And our go-to is to try harder, to do more. But I like starting with what just needs to change in our imagination about what's possible and what's true that can help shape what we live out of. Changing our imaginations, changing the story we tell ourselves about our life, and orienting ourselves to this honeybee kind of work in the world. What would change in your imagination to be able to trust that way of following Jesus? So the second thing I found fascinating about bees is how they work together. Every bee does a specific task that all contribute, and the queen is kind of in charge, and the rest of them kind of work around that. So you have the queen, you have the drones, which are the males, and they pretty much serve the one purpose of fertilizing queen's eggs, and after that they often promptly kind of die. Then there are the worker bees, and they're all females. So bee biology is a whole other thing. It took me a little bit to get my head wrapped around it. I'm not going to get into it. But they have the worker bees. They're all female babies of the queen. They all do the jobs of maintaining the hive, feeding the other babies, cleaning or cooling or guarding the hive. Then there are the foragers. They go out, find the pollen and the nectar, and they tell their siblings about it. They bring it home, and they feed the colony. The byproduct of that is that we get, that food grows and that we get honey, right? So that's amazing in and of itself, all the parts doing the roles. But there's two little bits of bee collaboration that are sticking out to me. So the first is the scale of the collaboration. So each bee contributes a teensy tiny part, but it's these teensy tiny parts that make up a big whole. So every year, a typical hive requires about 40 pounds of pollen and 250 pounds of nectar to be gathered, the latter of which, when mixed with the bee's glandular enzymes and thickened, amounts to about 130 pounds of honey. So consider that 1 pound of honey represents the sweetness of about 10 million blossoms, and that one forager produces only 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in their entire life. 1/12 of a teaspoon. So that's smaller than a pea, maybe 2 grains of rice. I don't know. How amazing is that with an individual adding only 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey, a hive could then produce 130 pounds of honey, right? So there's a lot of bees doing a tiny amount of work to create a big product. And not only is what each bee contributes kind of small, it's not even finished in their lifetime. So the work of a hive over summer is multi-generational. So bees don't live very long, a few weeks really at the most. So in a summer of hive activity, a couple of generations will come and go. And this is the long view of collaboration, isn't it? So we can kind of like start to think, okay, what's God saying that to us about how we work together and how we collaborate? While we might not see the full harvest of our work, it is still fruitful and it is still adding to something. Paul got this. St. Paul in the Bible. He used the metaphor of the body, but he got this. So in 1 Corinthians 12, this is familiar, and I think I preached about it actually not very long ago. But there's different kinds of gifts, he writes, but the same Spirit distributes them. There's different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There's different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it's the same God at work. A little bit later, he writes, "For we were all baptized by one Spirit to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body's not made up of one part, but of many. And then in a different book, he writes to the Romans, something he's pretty clear. I like how he gets even a little bit scoldy about it. He's like, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Rather, think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God's distributed to you. For just as each of us has one body with lots of members, and these members do not have all the same function, that's how it is in the body of Christ. We're one small part, and each part is absolutely needed. But not one part is not more important than any of the other parts. All the different parts working together is absolutely necessary. So not only do the bees work together to produce way more than the sum of their parts, they do it by each individual bee growing and developing to do tasks as they age. So these are the worker bees. Worker bees grow up and then they move through their worker tasks in age-based sequence. So from cleaning cells, roughly week 1 on average, to tending the queen and brood, that's roughly week 2, to handling nectar and building a comb, roughly week 3, to guarding the entrance and foraging outside the nest, roughly week 3 to 4, and then kind of up until their death. As each stage is reached, glands for brood feeding or wax production develop on schedule, the appropriate behaviors kick in, and the whole colony runs with an efficiency that makes it the envy of mere humans. So I was reflecting on this, and the question I had was this: are we, as members of a community, moving and growing into new roles as we age and we develop? Are we maturing, or are we just getting older? Because we could just get older, or we can be maturing as we get older. Are we staying where we're comfortable, never answering what's kind of being asked of us now? Or are we open? Are we listening for the next thing? Are we maturing, developing, letting our inner hearts be transformed so that we can embody even more of what God intended us to be and how God intended us to work together? And I think sometimes that can be seen as an individualistic thing, like I'm working on myself, I'm working to understand myself, I'm working to grow my own skills, fulfill my potential. And if we leave it there, it is an individualistic thing. But that work needs to happen for the benefit of the whole. The whole group needs each individual member to grow into what they are supposed to be growing into next, just like the worker bees need to grow into the different tasks they have to do to keep the hive running. Healthy communities need its members to grow and develop and to be transformed. So the question I was asking is, where am I being asked to change and move into new roles, new understandings, new wisdom? Am I resisting for any reason? Can I trust enough to change, to even understand myself and my role in my community in a new way? And Paul even talked about this a little bit too, and still in the context of the body in 1 Corinthians. He talked about the limits of what we think we know in our giftings, in our roles. And he said what is important. He talked about this, how one part is not more important than the goal, which was love. He said, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but then I grew up, I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. And he's talking specifically in that phrase is specifically in the context of how everything works together. You have to grow, you have to mature, you have to develop, you have to come into your own. As part of a healthy community. So what are you being invited into changing in this season? Are there new areas or places opening up to you? Here's a question for me. What is the specific task of your maturing that this season is asking of you? Because the whole body, we need you to do that. So we've got those two aspects of bee collaboration, doing small, multi-generational things and grasping what it means to do your own work, to be part of the whole. And that's how the kingdom is made tangible. So one last thing that we could see from the bees this morning is kind of stepping back from bees themselves and looking at the role of the beekeeper and the act of beekeeping. So a common thing, apparently, among beekeepers is beekeepers back. That's what the book said. These beekeepers might say, I don't know what he's talking about. Beekeeper's back. So it's hard work being a beekeeper. You're bending over, and those things are heavy when they're full of honey, right? It's back-breaking work. And in fact, beekeeping, but there's kind of this what's the word? Something glamorous about beekeeping, but it's actually kind of hard work, isn't it? Zach was just telling me about his dad's friend who was doing all this work to maintain and kind of revitalize a hive. So Potoc often gets calls from people wondering about beekeeping, but their questions often kind of revolve around, how easy is it? So how much time will I have to put in to get the honey I want? How much honey am I going to get? And Poteau reflected that if that's kind of where you're starting with beekeeping, you're probably not even going to get very far. Because for questions like that the bees are a means to an end, which is profit or an end result. But to be a good beekeeper, you have to be into the act of beekeeping. And beekeeping is messy and sticky and sometimes painful if you get a sting, right? And it requires hard and consistent work, hence the beekeeper's back. But what I kind of gathered from Ken and Louise talking and from the books I was reading is that it's often kind of just uneventful and slow. And only seeing it for what it can result in is verging into this idealism that can be dangerous because it focuses on outcomes and not the present need or the process. Being focused on an ideal end often will cause frustration and it will cause a dismissal of the present. It's not turning out how I wanted it to. I'm going to leave it alone, right? And that hinders the actual outcome. We live in a culture, I think we can admit this, of idealized results all the time, right? There's a writer, Dan White Jr., and he wrote, "Idealism in its culturally appropriated forms infects our ability to accept reality. It infects our ability to work within reality and find real contentment within reality. Idealism has infiltrated most of our society and cajoles us to exalt our preferred dreams as authority over the raw, complicated, messy, relational material before us." I'm just going to read that one more time. Idealism cajoles us to exalt our preferred dreams as authority over the raw, complicated, messy, relational material before us. I think we can get lost when idealism drives us and what we expect should happen. So that can happen in our own lives. It can happen in our churches. It can happen when we put stuff on leaders. It can happen in our families with our kids' behavior. You should be acting like this. And if that's all I'm focused on, I'm not paying attention to what's actually going on. Idealism can infect our marriages, ourselves. How often are we berating ourselves for our lack of living up to our own ideal in our own hearts? But I think what paying attention to the beekeeper could offer us this morning is this, that if we are not able to live into what is right in front of us and only want to work for our ideal, only want to work in our ideal, well, we're going to miss the work of the Spirit in what's right in front of us. Because again and again, it's in that messy relational stuff of our homes and our communities that goodness and mercy actually show up. You don't need grace and mercy to work in a perfection vacuum. You don't even need it. But grace and mercy happen in the messy relational, real life stuff of our lives. It's one of those paradoxes. When we lay down our idealistic visions and stop chasing after the end result we've envisioned for our neighborhood, or our families, or our lives, or our careers, we begin to see something emerge that can transform how we live and thrive. Pining after the ideal never creates the transformation needed. It only happens in the mess of real life. Shannon Martin is an author we read again earlier in the spring, and she wrote, "To obsess over positive outcomes is to miss the slow simmer of redemption." So as a beekeeper, you can't micromanage the bees. You can't keep opening up the hive to check. You can't direct them and contain them and give them orders. You can't contain the weather. You can't make sure that happens according to what you want. You can only consistently create healthy spaces to the best of your ability for the bees to live their full potential out. And often that's kind of all that's required for you to do in order for them to thrive. So the question we could ask here might be, have there been times when idealism about what a family should be, what a community should be, what a church should be, what a human being should be, has there been times when that idealism has distracted you from doing the work of creating healthy spaces for living, for thriving? And when we put that idealism aside, could you experience the human in front of you in all of their complexity and beauty? Could you experience your neighborhood right around you in all of its messy and complexity and the people you don't like? Could you experience that as a location for grace and mercy? Could that be the real place where God works? Could we start to see the people and the communities around us with eyes and an imagination that has a gracious love that demands nothing, but seeds hope in everything. So to end this morning, the last thing this book really challenged me, and thinking about bees really challenged me too, and it reminded me of the phrase, the land of milk and honey. So if you know the Old Testament story, the Israelites, they're saved from slavery, they're wandering the desert, and they've been told they get to go into this promised land, this land of milk and honey. And I love how God's images for what our lives could be and we're invited to be are such tangible images, the land of milk and honey. But both milk and honey, if you think about it for a second, they're products of cultivation. They indicate that the land is safe enough, there's peace enough, there's enough people working healthily enough to produce milk, to produce honey, right? When slavery and fear and kind of that denigration of the image of God, that marked the people of God's beginnings. But the promise is that milk and honey will be able to come from the land where they are. And so that tells us that where we are is not the end of the story. There is a promise of peace, of thriving, of flourishing, and that's where we're heading to. So again, we live this story out in our generation, in our time. In fairly affluent Northwest Calgary, where money and busyness can maybe mask need, they could mask poverty. Poverty sometimes makes us uncomfortable, and emotional and relational poverty, well, those are largely thought to be other people's problems. But we are being asked to live out of this story, to choose life in the present, to lean into this promise of a land of milk and honey, where there's peace enough for thriving, where the bees can do their work, where the community can do its work to provide enough life for everyone, right? And we're invited to help to participate in that, to be those cultivators, to be those keystone species. And we can do that. We can be those keystone species by maturing in our own selves and by contributing what we have to offer to the community. And we can do this too by not demanding perfection or idealism, but living in grace in the present. And I call this the dynamic and responsive life of the Spirit in our real neighborhoods. And I think this is a good news story. And I was just really thinking about how I think the road is poised and postured to be this kind of community in Northwest Calgary. And then as we go to our communities, our hockey communities and our work communities, we can be those kind of people in those spaces. So those are some of the things I gleaned from looking at the bees. If you go and look at the bees, I wonder what you would see. I'm always, your thoughts and responses, I'm always interested to hear. But I think that's where we'll leave that today, and I'll pray to end that time.